Thank you, Zoe. Welcome, welcome everyone. I'm really happy to be here today. So I will be chairing this panel. So what are we going to be discussing here? The idea behind this panel is really to convene experts on data trusts. We've been talking about data institutions all morning and this beginning of this afternoon, but we're going to really focus on data trusts here. We are going to ask them to update us on their work over the past year. We're also going to be discussing some of the challenges to practical experiments, and then share where are we going next, really, what will be the experiments going forward. So with me today, I just wanted to present the different experts I have together with me. So Sylvie Delacroix is a professor in law and ethics at the University of Birmingham and an Alan Turing Institute and Mozilla Fellow. We've got Jack Hardinges, who is my colleague, and he's the ODI program lead for data institutions, which is sort of our home for any work related to data trusts and other approaches to stewarding data. And I've also got Aline Blankertz, who leads the project Data Economy at the Stiftung Neue, Verantwortung, which I'm going to refer to as NV from now on, an independent think tank in Berlin. She develops initiatives related to data policy recommendations and relating, among others, to data competition and data trusts. So as it happened so far in this event, what I'll of course do is monitor any questions coming up and leave enough time at the end to cover those questions. But let's get started with a few here. Let me just start with exploring what's your current work really related to data trusts. So let's start with you, Sylvie, if you don't mind. Could you tell us a bit more about this idea of bottom-up data trusts?
Okay, thanks, Pauline. So bottom-up tries to convey the idea that at the heart of this whole project on data trust is a commitment to complementing what are essentially, for the moment, top-down interventions when it comes to data governance. Yeah, so regulation such as the GDPR is extremely important, but I don't think it can be the only answer in terms of addressing the considerable vulnerabilities at stake, and also the fact that we can do better when it comes to responsible data sharing. And so really, bottom-up data trust come down to probably three key points. The first one is, I think we can do better than the current consent-based framework at the heart of the GDPR. Yeah, this consent mechanism at the moment, I don't think is serving us as well as it could. And so at the heart of the idea of bottom-up data trust is the idea that we want to empower people to take the reins of their data by pooling together the rights they have over their data in a structure, and that's the trust, the data trust, which is then managed by a data trustee. So the first point is empowering people to take the reins of their data. The second one is really to empower groups. Yeah, at the moment, the legal governance structure as it exists doesn't really have much to say about groups. And when you think that data necessarily involves groups, people who are related to each other, this is an important missing piece in the governance landscape as it exists today. And then the third point is really that it's high time we facilitate better, more responsible data sharing, and to remedy the situation where we find ourselves in conversations where either you talk protect people and addressing vulnerabilities, or you're talking about data sharing. And these two concerns are not enough put together. They are not joined enough. And I think bottom-up data trust effectively have the potential to facilitate responsible data sharing while at the same time addressing considerable vulnerabilities that come from the data we leak on a daily basis. And the fact that today we really need some kind of intermediary layer between us, the data subjects, and them, the data controllers. That means that potentially, instead of clicking away some little windows that tell you, do you consent to your data being used for this or that, you actually log in to, say, Amazon via your data trust portal, and that sets the terms and conditions according to which your data can be used. I should stop here because I could keep going for too long, but that's the 3 points that I wanted to convey.
Thank you very much, Sylvie. And I'm sure I'll get back to you, of course, with some other questions anyway, because we're really curious about this concept. But maybe as a sort of follow-up question, but for you, Aline, so we know the SNV has been working on the idea of data trust in a consumer setting. Could you tell us a bit more about that, and potentially also if it does marry or not with the 3 points that Sylvie just raised?
Yes, I mean, of course, I think the consumer setting is the one where we also basically agreed that there's the greatest potential and the greatest need for data trust. So to have this layer that consumers can trust and give them a real way to exercise their data rights. I mean, what we see is that data trusts are really considered an appealing concept by all political parties in Germany, and even also by a lot of companies. Kind of the concept is being taken far beyond kind of the pure consumer context. And that's an opportunity, but it's also a risk, because you might end up making this concept even more abstract to then encompass really all of those different interpretations. So that what we've been trying is to make sure that this discussion is guided in a way that data trusts really bring the benefit that we hope that they can bring, so that they actually, and I totally agree with Sylvie on that they protect those who are involved in the data creation, and those are mainly or very often consumers, but can also be, for example, small businesses. And on the other hand, kind of facilitate more data sharing in the interests of all those parties involved in the data creation. And one very key message that we have been repeating is that it's important to start small. And I think the ODI with its pilot is a really great example for that, because there is a certain risk in kind of drawing up on a whiteboard kind of the perfect structure, but then it gets really hard to actually get there. So you also need to think about transition. And we need to be honest about all the open questions that are related to data trust, and be willing to learn with the help of real life examples. And one question we get very often is where we should start. And to be honest, it does not really matter. There shouldn't be just one example, but we need more. So let's just take what's easiest. There are some ideas relating to health, and I found the sessions this morning very informative in this regard. Another area is mobility, and there people also want more data to flow, but in a way that does not increase current power imbalances. So, well, we are also working with others to bring data trust to life, and also help make sure that this political momentum is put to good use.
Thank you very much, Aline. And quite interesting that you just mentioned as well the sort of the importance of starting small, and sort of the where to start, and I guess we'll get back to that. But maybe to jump on that, and Jack, if you wouldn't mind telling us a bit more about obviously the ODI's point of view on this topic, and where we've got to on related to our thinking around data trusts, and where they might be used.
Yeah, sure. So just first to say that Sylvie and Aline's work has been really informative for us. So really pleased to have them joining the panel this afternoon. So bear with me, I'm going to start broad and then narrow in. So I think it's fair to say a feature of our work to date on data institutions means that we've come across a real diverse set of them. So organizations that we would recognize as stewarding data on behalf of others, often for public aims or purposes. You'll have seen today that that's quite an encompassing lens. So the data coalitions idea from Radical Exchange is quite different to Tom and his colleagues' work on open ownership and sort of their work to bring together open data that anyone can access, use and share. And so a lot of these examples aren't deliberately trying to put in place a particular type, let's say, of stewardship or governance, if you prefer that term. They've emerged quite naturally, and I think it's fair to say many of them have found an approach and settled on an approach in terms of their legal structure or form and sort of the governance and how they come to decisions about the data they control in ways that have served them and their ecosystems and communities quite well. But then there are people and organizations coming at this with particular types, forms, approaches of stewardship that they're looking to put in place and advocating for and wanting to see others adopt. So in some of the circles that we and I like to hang out in, this is data cooperatives. So groups of people coming together to contribute data to a co-op, having some sort of degree of equal say in what that's used for and a share in its profits, if that's what it's there to bring about. In other circles, people are thinking hard about data commons and how things like Elinor Ostrom's principles could be applied to data in the same way that they've been applied to communal resources like forests and fisheries. And so at the EI, we see data trust as sitting alongside these preconceived, if you like, ideas and principles of stewardship and applying them to data. And at a really high level, as I know this is supposed to be a session focused on progress and action rather than definitions. To us, data trust provides independent fiduciary stewardship over data in the same way that they do that and have done that for other resources. And again, that's really where we've been inspired by Sylvie and her colleague Neil Lawrence's work and that of others. And from an ODI point of view, then we see data trust as being useful perhaps in two different settings. And this is where we might be slightly different to Sylvie and Aline's work so far. So one is definitely that bottom-up approach that Sylvie's described. So where a group of people come together to establish a data trust, defer some of their rights and control over data to a trustee or set of them, and in doing so really seek to rebalance the control that they as a group or individuals would otherwise have over data. And we were talking just before the session, I think of that as having some, and I'll borrow Sylvie's term for this, some similar active ingredients, if you like, to say Matt at Radical Exchange's data coalition idea. But then the second, and again, this is perhaps where we as ODI have been slightly different, is that we're also interested in data trust in a more organizational setting. And I'll phrase this one as a question that perhaps we can pick up afterwards, which is where does it make sense for an organization or group of them to defer control over data they've collected to an independent data trust? So I'm happy to pick up that question and sort of where we've got to in answering that second piece later on, but just wanted to set some sort of grounding for our work so far.
Right, thanks, Jack. I just wanted to check if either Sylvie or Aline had any sort of reaction to this question. There might be.
I do, actually. So on the latter question, it's really, thanks for raising it, Jack, because that really needs to be raised. So the term data trust in itself, yeah, as everybody knows on this panel, has been used and abused, right? And so there have been an uphill struggle, which I think we are getting much better at now in terms of distinguishing between different types of data institutions. And they each fulfill very important aims, yeah? So data collaboratives, data commons, data co-ops, etc. I'm not going to go through the details. We have a blog that hopefully helps. Actually, we try to delineate what each type of institution is good at in terms of aims and attitudes to risk. But what I wanted to catch on, Jack, when you said, oh, to what extent does it make sense to enable a group of organizations to potentially, this is actually illustrates the problem. Is it delegate? Because the problem is organizations as such will not have personal rights over their data, of course. Yeah, they don't have GDPR rights. They're not persons. And so what do they have? They might have IP rights. Okay. Now, can those IP rights be placed in a trust? Well, in principle, they could. Any positive right in principle can be placed in a trust, right? So this then raises the question, why would you do that? Yeah, you still have to say, what advantage does it give you over basically a contractual agreement for data, responsible data sharing between organizations? And that is a question that is not easy to answer when it comes to organizations. Because when it comes to persons, individuals like you and me, we're vulnerable, and we have very little ability to really have control over what's happening over our data and to truly understand all our rights and responsibilities in relation to our data. Organizations, depending on the resources they have, are placed in different situations. And so it's not entirely clear to what extent the term data trust would be more for PR than for anything else in this case, because if you can do all you need to do with a control structure, then comes the question, why should you create a trust if it doesn't add value compared to a contractual structure? And that is something I'd love to discuss more. I just thought I would put that in the pool for discussion, if it helps.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much, Sylvie. And I'm sure, well, knowing you all on this panel, I'm sure we could get talking about the different concepts and the different approaches for a while. I know I have a mission here with this panel, which is talking about also a bit of the future. And before the future, let's say the current situation. And I just wanted to move us on this topic just for a few minutes, because so we now covered a bit of what the different organizations are thinking around this concept of data trust. And I was wondering if I could ask you, so maybe let's start with you, Aline. What's sort of the progress to date? What is your feeling around what, for instance, you have tried to do with SNV and where we are now, really?
Well, I mean, we do not build data trusts ourselves. But as I said, we work with others to help overcome the existing barriers that stop data trusts from coming to life. And at the moment, we work on two main challenges. The first is very much related to what Sylvie was just talking about. Under German law, it is not straightforward to put data in a trust because there is no trust law as in the UK and other jurisdictions. I mean, and let alone put a data right in a trust. So one important question is how individuals can delegate their data rights to a trustworthy institution. And that's where kind of different organizations are currently trying to figure out kind of what the legal status quo is. GDPR, I mean, for all the good it does, it also puts a heavy burden on individuals to be informed and make choices. Where people currently agree is that individuals can probably have a service that they can configure according to their interests, and the service would notify them if a data using service does not conform to their interests. And that's kind of a useful first step, but it's really kind of still quite far away from where we would data trust like to be. And the second challenge is around business models. There's a very active debate on what kind of business model is permissible or recommendable. So should the data trust be public, should it be private, or something in between? We think it's too early to limit the options too much. So again, we say, well, let's experiment. One way to make sure there are no kind of toxic business models that kind of scale up too quickly is that certification could be helpful to ensure that the business model is set up such that its interests are aligned with those on whose behalf it should act. And there is a lot of activity around PIMs, so those personal information management systems. And we think that kind of maybe one avenue to actually bring data trusts closer to life is to consider kind of turning one of those into a more collective institution. It's not happening at the moment, but it could be kind of one way of pursuing it in the closer future. Thank
you very much, Aline, and really, I'm glad that you started also bringing up some of the barriers and challenges. I think I might have a few more questions for you and for the others coming up. Before I do that, I just wanted to give you, Sylvie, an opportunity to give us also a sort of an update on like basically the current state related to bottom-up data trusts.
Sure. So, well, there's quite a few exciting things happening concretely. It's taking time, but we are seeing the seeds of several projects now, well, getting funding from a variety of charities to basically be constituted as pilots. Now, one of probably the most advanced, even though it's only been, I think, being launched today, I think there's a web page, is the Mozilla Data Futures Lab. Now, that is an initiative that is going to try and fund pilots. So it's really a case of people, I think there's going to be an application procedure, and the idea is to fund a variety of proposals. And at this stage, to not be too discriminate in terms of, they may not all be data trust. In fact, maybe a large majority of data collaboratives or data co-ops, because they tend to dominate for obvious reasons. I mean, from a business perspective, it is easier. It requires a less long-term perspective than a data trust, I think. But so this is really an exciting time where it's watching, keep track of what's happening. There's also an initiative that is being set up in Cambridge, where again, it's too early to even point you to a webpage, but there will be pilots that will be funded via this initiative. So I'm sorry that it's all very watch this space at the moment, but I am truly excited because it's not an easy thing to go from theory. I mean, only 2 years ago we wrote that paper to the model we were writing about seeing a light of day. I find that extremely exciting, and in my world, 2 years is very quick for a theoretical concept like that to come to life. So so I am fully committed, and I would like to use this time to actually say, anybody who's listening to this and who's, for instance, in Germany, this really interesting position is that, yes, there is no trust law, but you have institutions like Sparkassen that are relying, that have embedded fiduciary duties. And the question that we are considering now, it's really a live question, is whether the fact that there are fiduciary duties that are embedded in those institutions means that we could create a data trust via existing institutions in Germany. That is a fascinating question, and I wanted to flag this because there is really an opportunity to not be limited to only those countries that have trust law. I do not think this is the case. And we are actively going to fund research in this area to explore the applicability of data trust in non-trust law countries. It's essential. So yeah, I just wanted to say, please get in touch if you're interested also, because I am very curious to hear about initiatives from different fronts and different backgrounds. Different countries, of course, come with different constraints on this front, and it's an exciting time.
Nice, very, very exciting indeed, Sylvie, and thank you for this update. And I guess there's quite a lot of people who are gonna check a few of those initiatives coming up, and especially, well, us. I can say that for sure. Jack, let's get back to the ODI's perspective, and how does progress look like on our side?
Sure. So at the ODI, we were really pleased last year, so 2019, which seems a long time ago now, to work with the UK Government Office for AI to experiment with data trust. So this was in Q1 of 2019. And as Aline said, this was starting small. So this was intended to be an input into the conversation and a sharing of our findings, rather than a final definitive answer on data trust, or actually even to establish something that, as Sylvie says, I think will take a bit more time to move from theory into practice, and then to sustainability, right? There's nothing inherently sustainable about what we're talking. So I think there'll be a difference between seeing things launched and then proving sustainable over the long run. In the same way that UK Biobank, we can look back on over the last 15 years, and it's not necessarily something that is a month or a minimal amount of years old. So using the framing that I introduced at the beginning, we were definitely seeking to understand more about the potential of the style of data trust where organizations would put data into trust, so to speak. So I'll be explicit here, that project and those pilots weren't about trialing this sort of bottom-up variant of data trusts where individuals would defer or delegate some of their rights over personal data in the way that Sylvie's described. But saying that, we remain very interested in that approach as well. And although the project was fairly short, we thought that we covered a fair amount of ground in that time. So particularly in terms of understanding the types of opportunities that this type of data stewardship, if we think of it as that, could address. So the organizations that we engaged with, and in particular, I'm thinking of the data holders, so organizations that had approached us interested in data trust at the time, were charities and NGOs that held data, public bodies that had collected data, as well as sort of private sector organizations as well. And they described to us an interest in putting data into trust for different reasons. One of the reasons they described was that actually delegating responsibility in this way was quite attractive to them for different purposes or different reasons. So some described that in order to make the most of the data that they'd collected, not necessarily personal data, but data they'd collected for sort of maximum public benefit or public good, they didn't necessarily feel that they had the skills or the time or the capacity to ensure that would happen. So some thought that deferring that responsibility to a data trust would be useful and maximize the social, economic, environmental impact of that data. Some, I should say, thought of that entirely as a cost-saving exercise. So actually, there's probably a fine line between useful delegation and deferring and actually abdicating responsibility for data. That was something that we thought quite interesting at the time. Others thought that their ecosystems needed a degree of independence or an independent body. In that case, a data trust, to balance the interests of different parties. So especially among data holders who might otherwise have no incentives to increase access to data for fears over sort of competitiveness or a mistrust in each other. So in that sense, a data trust could play an important role in holding data contributed by multiple parties and exerting a degree of independent stewardship over it and making it available to third parties, perhaps for research and development or other purposes. And then lastly, we found that organizations were quite interested in putting data into trust to respond to demands from their consumers or partners. So this felt like one for the future. So to phrase this again as a question, might we trust a provider of a digital service that collects some data about its users? Might we trust that service more if the data that's being collected is governed or stewarded by someone or something independent from that organization and its particular commercial imperatives? Again, a question and one that I think there's an array of different answers to. Just to reflect, so hopefully, Sylvie, that speaks to some of sort of your questions around why that. I think there's a follow-on question around whether or not that's over-engineering or useful, and actually working out and establishing where that is appropriate or where those objectives could better be met through other approaches is a big part of the prize. And actually, one of the challenges to data trust is working out where this particular variant or approach to stewardship is required or not.
I just wanted to check with you, Sylvie, if you had any reactions to that. I didn't want to prevent you from saying anything.
I mean, so one, well, let's not call it a struggle, but a commitment that I feel it's a role I have to play is to try and insist on using the word data trust for structures that are actually using trust law, and that means fiduciary responsibilities. Too often people like the term, it sounds good, data trust, who wouldn't like that? But actually use the term for contractual structures. That there's nothing wrong with contractual structures, and you can create data co-ops and data collaboratives, for instance, which are fantastic, which are a way of empowering groups based on contracts, and there's a role for them, but they should not be confused with data trust, which really come with a different legal framework, with much more rigorous protections, basically, for persons, for the people who put their data rights in the trust. So the whole point for me of a data trust is to acknowledge and address the considerable vulnerabilities that come from the fact that data sharing really exposes you potentially to very long-term harms if it's not done well. And so I do think it's important that we keep being precise in using different terms for different things. And I think that when it comes to organizations wanting to responsibly share data, at the moment, I have yet to see an example where a trust structure was warranted. Yeah, I have yet to see an example where it's convinced me that this is necessary to have a trust law structure. I think in most cases, organizations can do responsible data sharing by being based on a contract. I would love to be proven wrong, and please contact me if you think of an example that shows that actually there is a need for trust law in those cases. But so yes, that's the only message, is precision, which matters when you are creating new types of institutions.
And if I may jump in for a second, I mean, you did mention that. I mean, it's tricky to talk about that in countries where you don't have the legal structure, and you also acknowledge, I mean, basically, and I talked about it as a challenge, but I think there will be solutions how a data trust setup can work in Germany, for example, because many of the concepts, we know them in other contexts, just not in relation to data. And we will need probably, I mean, hopefully a little bit of legal creativity gets us closer. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether we need legal changes that will then allow us to come to, well, that allow us to build data trust as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry, it's just, Aline, I couldn't agree more. And I think this is a really important area for future development, where it's fascinating. And there are actually groups at European level that are working on the extent to which, you know, the functions that are fulfilled by trust can actually be fulfilled by under different names in different legal systems. And in Germany in particular, I'm fascinated by this sarcasm and the fiduciary responsibilities that are embedded in there. I think it's a very good potential case study for translation into a non-trust law country.
Before I move to potentially a next question, I just wanted to check with you, Jack, if it was a hand that was raised or if it was just, if you wanted to say something.
Yeah, sure. So in many ways, I agree with Aline and Sylvie. I guess where perhaps we have been slightly different and will continue to be is that I think we are interested in the application of data trust in those two different environments. So I should be clear, I am being precise and talking about data trust here rather than data institutions, which, as we know, encompass a much broader range of types, approaches, legal forms. And so I think we are open to their application in that second sort of organizational environment. And I don't think we're necessarily alone in that. So I remember when we first sort of came into data trust a couple of years ago, we were really inspired by an article that had been written by Keith Boccaro and perhaps Sean McDonald as well, who I should shout out as having another sort of really influential impact on our thinking on data trust. And they were talking about organizations sort of establishing this kind of hands-off role with the data trust. So where there will be that sort of degree of deference to a data trust over data that they would otherwise fully control. And in some cases, that being useful in terms of building trust or demonstrating trustworthiness with their users. So just to say, I think we are being precise in the term here, but actually we might disagree slightly about where there might be another type of opportunity for data trust to address. Perhaps that might be a useful way of thinking about it.
Right. Thanks, Jack. Because we once again, I know we could talk about the different concepts for quite a while. I just want to once again bring us back to sort of back to reality and back to what's happening really right now. I think so, Aline. Thanks for raising some of the barriers and challenges in your earlier points, you know, related to like the business models, certification, etc. I just wanted to check, well, potentially with you, Jack and Sylvie, as well, if there were any other challenges that you wanted to raise that could be, I don't know, they could be technical, they could be related to funding in your work related to data trust. Let's maybe start with you, Sylvie.
Okay, well, to me, the next big step, and that's why I'm so excited to have Aline on this panel, is we really need more economists working on the long-term sustainability of data trust, but also other types of data institutions. Data trust in particular present specific challenges, I think. My hunch so far, but I haven't studied this in as much detail as I would like, my hunch is that they will require a more long-term business plan than, say, a data collaborative or data co-op. And I think we need, if there's any economists listening, or if you know economists who might be interested in this, please get in touch, because we're desperate to find, I mean, Aline is the only person I know who is an economist and who works on this. And so we need more of you, Aline, working on this, because I think that's the big next step. There are others, of course, but this is one particular challenge.
Thanks a lot, Sylvie. So a big call out to any other Aline out there, get in touch, because we need more economists. And I'm sure, well, I'm not checking the chat at the same time, but there's quite a lot of work going on at the ODI as well around sustainability. So I guess we couldn't agree more. Is there anything else you wanted to raise, Jack, in terms of any challenges we might have run into?
Yeah, I guess maybe two from me, both of which we've probably begun to touch on. So I think one, there's a knowledge challenge, and by knowledge I mean sort of people being aware of this world and its richness in terms of the different approaches and experimentation going on in terms of different ways of stewarding and sharing data. This sort of real diverse set of data institutions, both existing and future, that we're beginning to point to, but also the ability to navigate that world, pick out the bits that are important to them, and then usefully begin to apply them in their own contexts. I think that's a really difficult challenge at the moment. And so events like this are our attempt to try to help and address that, and to share and inspire and hopefully bring about some action in this space. And I think a big part of that challenge is that data is so contextual. So a point that we're making in many different places at the moment. So it differs so vastly depending on what data you're talking about, who has an interest and rights to it, and so on. And so what I found that actually trying to produce guidance and research into data trust, but also data institutions at large now, that's both rich in detail and integrity, but also simple and straightforward, it's difficult. I wanted just to use this as a chance to point people in the direction of a report that came out, I think, last week, that I found really useful on that front, and represents really useful guidance, is from Sage Bionetworks on bringing structure and design to data governance, which I really recommend. At the ODI, we're working on our own sort of explainers and guidance that we hope brings further clarity to this role by mainly showing off its richness and diversity. And if you're interested in being involved in that, then please let me know, because we'd love to do that as a collaborative effort rather than just one organization. And then the second, perhaps slightly more sort of structural piece is one of funding. So I'm really interested that Sylvie brought up Mozilla's new Data Futures Lab, as that was on my list to share as well. So I think with data trust, regardless of whether we're talking about the bottom-up approach or the organizational one that we've spoken a bit about today, and actually data institutions and stewardship at large, I think there's a real funding challenge. So it takes effort and expertise to apply, test, and experiment with these approaches. Not every data institution will need the £90 million or so in funding that UK Biobank has been established with, but they do require some degree of runway and financing to test and experiment. And so to end maybe slightly positively from my point of view, I think things like the Data Futures Lab at Mozilla is a positive development and will support not only new data trusts, but new data cooperatives, commons, and other novel approaches to data stewardship. And also as a small non-for-profit, the ODI, there's a limit to how much we can do to really move the needle on funding an entire landscape, but we are trying to support others experimenting with this as well. So we have 7 new data institutions and data access initiatives that we're funding at the moment through our R&D program. There's a booth, so have a look at them, see what you think. And then also there'll be further cohorts that we're looking to take on in the future and provide with similar support. So small levels of funding, as well as access to some of our guidance in this network. And actually, we're interested in hosting data institutions in the long run. And while these will be quite open calls, they'll be quite agnostic in terms of what type or approach of stewardship or governance these things will put in place. I'm hoping that some of them will be data trust. So I'm hoping that the ODI can play a supporting role itself.
Thanks a lot, Jack. I'm actually. Did you have something to say? Maybe Aline. I just wanted to check.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Just wanted to add on the point of funding. I mean, that's one of the key issues why I think it's important, or why we also work with politics and basically. I mean, I think Sylvie's work has shown very well that you don't need politics to get bottom-up data trust to work, but they can actually help create more favorable conditions. Kind of from an economic perspective, there is a very good rationale for some intervention, at least kind of to help get the critical mass in terms of infrastructure and experience with those business models, to make sure they can kind of emerge as something that can stand on its own. I'm a little bit, as I said, I'm not really decided whether this should be a fully private, a fully public enterprise. I think it shouldn't be fully public, to be honest. And I think you can have some safeguards for kind of data trust in private hands. But especially where we are right now, I mean, if we want a different data economy to emerge, there are some, as economists would say, some fixed costs associated with that, and that I wouldn't expect kind of even working business models to be able to absorb. So that's something where we also hope to see some change in the near future. And it's great to hear news about those initiatives which are already getting more momentum.
Thanks. Thank you very much. I'm just in the interest of time, I just wanted to leave the opportunity for people to ask some questions, and I've received a bunch of questions. So let's give a voice to the crowd out there behind their computers. So a first one that I would have is what types of organizations or sectors can responsibly hold a lead or participant role in a data trust? And this question was particularly raised in a context where, for instance, it's a major tech company. Does there need to be like a non-partisan intermediary? What would anyone want to take this question? Do I have a volunteer? Sylvie, yeah?
Yeah, actually, this is perfect because it touches. So I'll answer to that question. I think a corporation would have to basically fund as a separate entity a trust. Yeah, so because you have to avoid the conflict of interest. So a trustee can exercise the rights of the people who join the trust, but the trustee, because he or she has fiduciary responsibilities, cannot have any conflict of interest. And in this case, it cannot have a conflict of interest between responsibility to shareholders and responsibility towards the data subjects. And it's obvious why there could be a conflict at some point, i.e. monetization of data on one hand, protection on the other hand. But so that it can be done, but you'd have to set up a separate entity that you can just designate as the, I don't know, let's say you called AstraZeneca, the AstraZeneca sponsored data trust. You could, nothing stops you from doing that. But one thing I wanted to mention because of the private-public thing quickly, we actually have been talking with the smallest county council in the UK, Rutland Council, who is interested also in setting up a data stewardship type of institution, potentially a data trust. And so I think there is room for both public and private data trust. And it's in fact very important that there be a variety in my opinion.
Thanks a lot. Maybe just so I've got another one, which is a completely a different topic, but quite interesting. Any views or experience around designing and implementing data trusts for organizations that are operating at different geographic levels? So, for instance, a mix of national, regional, and local institutions. Do I have any reaction to that kind of question? Do we have experience in that? Maybe that's actually a really good question, difficult to answer. Jack, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm happy to answer that, but I'll answer it with the data institutions rather than the data trust lens. So I think that when we talk about data institutions, there's evidently those that are local, in some cases designed to be hyper-local, so for communities and individuals to exert control over data about that particular group. To give one example, we had hoped to be able to have Yeshi Milner at Data for Black Lives talk about her efforts at the moment to establish a new data institution to steward data on behalf of particular minority groups in the US. I would have that as kind of a hyper-local example, perhaps. I'm not sure exactly of the scale. I would have been interested to hear her talk more about that today. I'm sure there'll be more chances to, but that I see as something having a real local element to it. I also think that we see data institutions existing on a national scale. So UK Biobank, I'd have in that bracket, kind of operating at a national level. And then there's quite evidently those that need to operate internationally. So some existing forms of data institutions from an international point of view would point to organizations that we might not think of immediately as data organizations, but have a really important role to play in collecting, maintaining, combining data. So something like the World Health Organization comes to mind, and sort of its function of reporting statistics, for example. To us, that is a role to be played by a data institution, and of course has a real international element to it, cross-jurisdictional element to it as well. So hopefully useful answering that with the lens of data institutions rather than data trusts. I mean, Aline, Sylvie, if there's something more specific to data trusts you have in mind, then please shout. But from my point of view, I think there are examples to learn from in the data institution space about what it means to steward data at that international scale.
Yep, thank you very much, Jack. And maybe I've got one last question, because I know we're going to run out of time soon. But maybe for you, Aline, I just have a sort of a statement that you can react to. Is it like, for instance, if we would imagine like next year we have like a ton of new data trusts to point to, talk to, and learn from. Do you think that's something that could happen? Do you have any reaction to that kind of statement?
I think we have been at a fairly conceptual stage for a while. And I certainly also see here that people are really asking and want to do more, and there are kind of more ideas coming up. Some of them work, some of them won't work. So I can very well imagine ideally in the next year, we will see a lot more. Maybe it takes 2 years' time, and then it will be important to really carefully assess and evaluate which results we see in those to see kind of where to focus.
Thanks a lot. Well, thank you, everyone. This is the end. I can see the countdown, and I have to get back to Zoe now. Thank you very much for a very interesting panel. Thanks, everyone.